Bonjour tout le monde. On vient de passer 2 jours très productifs ici à Bruxelles où on a fait du gros travail avec les dirigeants à travers le monde et l'OTAN. We came here to continue to do our part to ensure that all leaders stand strong and united to support Ukraine against Russia and that our resolve continues to stay strong for as long as it takes. Putin needs to know that there will be no erosion of our determination and that the catastrophic costs of our sanctions will only grow over time as they punish him and his friends. Yesterday, I sat down with President von der Leyen of the European Commission and President Metsola of the European Parliament, as well as Prime Minister Sanna Marin of Finland. Today, I got to sit down with fellow NATO leaders, fellow G7 leaders, and had direct conversations with President Michel of the European Council, a direct conversation with Prime Minister of Japan, Fumio Kishida, and we got to hear twice from President Zelensky as he continues to demonstrate extraordinary leadership in the face of incredibly difficult situations. L'invasion illégale de Vladimir Poutine en Ukraine menace la sécurité de l'Europe et du monde, ainsi que celle des démocraties. Les alliés de l'OTAN continuent d'être unis dans leur réponse concertée et dans notre soutien à l'Ukraine et à son peuple. Today, we reaffirmed Canada's steadfast commitment to NATO. Canada leads the NATO Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Latvia, which includes 10 NATO countries. And we've pledged up to 3,400 troops to NATO's response force, including air, land, and maritime capabilities. Earlier this month, we renewed our commitment to Operation Reassurance, the Canadian Armed Forces' support to NATO's assurance and deterrence measures in Central and Eastern Europe. In addition, since 2015, Canadian Armed Forces mission Operation Unifier has trained over 30,000 of Ukrainian security forces, which means that as we see the Ukrainian military standing strong against the Russian invasion, the brave women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces can take pride in knowing they contributed directly to that. European security is important to Canadian security, and so we are always grateful to the brave women and men of CAF who've deployed thousands of kilometers from home to help protect Euro-Atlantic security and stand up strongly for the values we cherish at home and around the world. The world has come together to impose unprecedented and punishing sanctions on Putin and his enablers. Today, Canada will be increasing pressure by sanctioning 160 members of the Russian Federation Council who've facilitated and enabled this unjustified invasion, which brings the total of individuals connected to Putin who've been sanctioned by Canada to 964. On imposera aussi de nouvelles mesures d'interdiction des exportations qui visent à affaiblir les capacités militaires russes dans des domaines comme l'électronique, l'informatique, les télécommunications, les capteurs et lasers, la navigation et l'avionique, la marine, l'aérospatiale et les transports. Putin has and is continuing to commit war crimes and create a devastating humanitarian crisis. We'll be announcing the allocation of $50 million from our humanitarian aid contribution to the World Food Programme, the World Health Organization, the UN Refugee Agency, the organization People in Need, and the Canadian Red Cross. Les bombardements et les attaques menacent les lieux culturels et patrimoniaux qui sont importants pour la culture ukrainienne. Donc on va verser 4,8 millions de dollars à des entités comme l'UNESCO pour les protéger. Poutine a fait des graves erreurs. Une, ça a été de sous-estimer la fortitude et le courage du peuple ukrainien. Ils sont en train de démontrer comment ils peuvent se battre pour protéger leur patrimoine. Mais il a aussi fait l'erreur de penser que nous étions divisés. Ce qu'on a vu et ce qu'on continue de voir dans des journées comme aujourd'hui, où on a des rencontres exceptionnelles, c'est que l'OTAN demeure unie. Et il a fait un mauvais calcul. On est fort et unis et on va le rester. Canada and its partners and allies will continue to work in lockstep to hold Putin and Russian leadership accountable and always be there to support Ukraine and its people. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Merci, Monsieur le Premier ministre. On va maintenant passer aux questions dans la salle. We'll now take questions in the room.
There was a call today to increase spending among NATO members to help support particularly long-term stuff that NATO is doing. What is Canada doing on those fronts? If we spending more money, what's happening?
Over the past number of years, we've put forward ambitious increases in spending for NATO as part of our strong, secure, engaged commitment of a few years ago. We continue to step up in our capabilities and our commitment to NATO in Central and Eastern Europe and elsewhere around the world, and we will continue to be increasing our defense spending.
Following up.
Yeah, can you give us any actual dollars there or specifics in any way, shape or form?
We continue to have those discussions at home. We have a budgetary process underway right now. We have a NATO meeting, a further NATO meeting in Spain in the coming months. Those are all things that are ongoing.
Next question.
Bonjour, M. Trudeau, Louis Blouin de Radio-Canada. Je veux poursuivre sur l'élan de ma collègue. Dans le budget qui s'en vient, j'aimerais que vous soyez clair. Est-ce qu'on va voir une augmentation des dépenses militaires et ça va nous placer où par rapport à cette cible de 2 %?
Évidemment, les investissements qui seront dans le budget seront annoncés lors du budget, mais je peux assurer les Canadiens que nous allons continuer de rester engagés et des membres qui contribuent énormément à l'OTAN. On est en Lettonie maintenant en train de diriger le groupe de bataille qui fait partie de l'opération Réassurance. On est continuellement en train de contribuer dans toutes les missions de l'OTAN. On va continuer de l'être. Comme j'ai dit, nos investissements dans nos forces armées vont continuer à augmenter et on en aura plus à dire en temps et lieu.
En suivi.
On apprend que le Canada va augmenter ses exportations de pétrole pour aider l'Europe. Pouvez-vous nous dire d'abord de combien, mais aussi, est-ce que ça nous rapproche, ça, de nos objectifs climatiques? Puis est-ce que c'est dire aussi que dans votre esprit, la crise ukrainienne doit passer devant la crise climatique en ce moment?
C'est une question dont on a énormément discuté, pas juste ces 2 derniers jours, mais aussi il y a 10 jours quand j'étais ici en Europe pour rencontrer les dirigeants européens. Évidemment, la dépendance de l'Europe sur le pétrole et le gaz naturel russe est un grave problème. Et avec les sanctions qui sont en train d'amener, avec tout ce qu'on veut faire pour punir Poutine et ses partenaires russes pour cette invasion injustifiée, nous cherchons à diminuer la dépendance sur ce pétrole et ce gaz naturel russe. Le Canada, depuis bien des années, continue à vouloir transformer notre dépendance sur les carburants fossiles pour être plus fiable sur l'énergie renouvelable, tout comme l'Europe est en train de faire. Et la conversation qu'on est en train d'avoir avec les autres leaders, c'est comment s'assurer qu'on est en train de financer cette transition à court terme, à moyen terme et certainement à long terme vers la carboneutralité pour 2050, vers nos cibles de réduction d'émissions en 2030, tout en s'assurant qu'on est en train de punir la Russie et soutenir nos alliés qui ont pour l'instant encore besoin de pétrole et de gaz naturel. C'est une conversation complexe, mais je peux rassurer les Canadiens que nous sommes déterminés et à continuer à protéger et à lutter contre les changements climatiques et d'assurer que la Russie ne profite aucunement de cette guerre illégale. These are conversations that we've had over the past couple of days here with leaders, but that we also had a couple of weeks ago when I was here. The contrast between the need to ensure that Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas ceases, that Russia is punished with crippling sanctions, where at the same time we're able to pivot more quickly towards renewables. And in the medium term and in the long term, that is something Canada continues to be committed to, but we recognize that replacing Russian oil and gas in the short term is going to be important. Canada can play perhaps a modest role in that, but our commitment to reaching net neutrality by 2050, to hitting our climate commitments by 2030, remains as firm as ever, and indeed, the partnerships we're looking at building with the European Union on issues of hydrogen, on issues touching renewables, are very promising in terms of getting the world not just off Russian oil and gas, but decarbonizing our energy economy entirely.
Prochaine question.
Prime Minister Murray Brewster with CBC. Wanted to seek a little more clarity on defense spending. Your government set out its spending plans, and there is increases. The Secretary General today said that all allied nations are going to be submitting revised military spending plans by the summit. Is Canada going to revise over and above what it already planned to spend on defense?
Murray, I think you've seen, as we all have, that the world has changed over the past 4 weeks. Seeing Vladimir Putin choose to not just invade a peaceful democratic nation, but to actually challenge the peace and stability that has led to unprecedented prosperity for Europe, for the Americas, for the world over the past 70 years, means that we will need to continue to step up. The good thing is, over the past number of years, as a government, we have continued to step up. We've increased our investments in defense, we've increased our contributions to NATO, and we are right now, in the context of the budget and in the context of the upcoming NATO meeting, as we signed on to the NATO declaration today, we'll continue to look at how we will continue to step up.
Following up.
And just to follow up, President Zelensky, in his address to NATO leaders, had a very specific list of military equipment that his government would like to see from allies: tanks, anti-ship missile systems, and aircraft. Do you support his call for allies to hand over that kind of equipment to Ukraine?
Every time I've spoken with President Zelensky, every time he has spoken either directly to leaders or in places like the Canadian Parliament just last week, he has made very strong pleas for more support. And as an alliance and as individual countries, we need to continue to do everything we can to get them that support. There is a sense right now that the Russian invasion is at a difficult spot, and that the Ukrainians are making a real difference, and we need to make sure that they have the tools to be able to continue to stand strong against Russian invaders. And that's why, as a world, or as an alliance, as individuals, individual countries, we've been sending both lethal and non-lethal aid. We've been sending financial supports to make sure that the Ukrainian government continues to function. It's continuing to be able to pay its citizens and its workers. That we've been there with support for neighboring countries who are welcoming refugees, support from humanitarian issues. We talked a lot today about the impending food crisis, not just in Ukraine, but around the world, because Ukraine is such a significant contributor to food around the world. Every step of the way, Canada is going to be part of doing what we can to help out in the best way possible. And what Vladimir Putin will see at the end of this day of exceptional, unscheduled meetings of the leading organizations in the world, from NATO to the G7 to the European Council, is a level of determination and resolve to continue to stand strong in support of Ukraine and against Russia's illegal invasion for as long as it takes.
Next question.
Hi, Prime Minister. It's Annie Bergeron-Oliver with CTV National News. I'm just going to follow up a bit on the question that Murray Brewster asked. Zelensky in his address was asking for more heavy equipment and more weapons. The Defence Minister, though, has said that Canada doesn't have any more lethal aid in its stockpiles to give to Ukraine. Why doesn't Canada have a larger stockpile? And are you actively procuring more for Ukraine?
We will be sending more lethal equipment to Ukraine in the coming days and weeks, as we've committed to do. We're going to continue to try and help out in the best possible way we can. And as President Zelensky's been asking for various new pieces of equipment, we're looking to see what we can send. At the same time, we're also committing to looking at procuring that equipment directly for the Ukrainians in other ways by working with allies and making investments necessary. So we will continue to do everything we can to make sure the Ukrainians have the tools necessary to continue their heroic defense, not just of their own homeland, but of the pillars of democracy for all of us. Nous allons continuer de chercher des moyens d'aider les Ukrainiens, y compris avec d'autres envois d'armes et d'équipements militaires. Nous sommes là pour aider dans la mesure du possible, incluant si on peut travailler avec des partenaires pour acheter des armes qu'on enverrait directement aux Ukrainiens. On sait qu'on est dans un moment important militairement pour les Ukrainiens qui peuvent continuer à pousser leur avantage sur une armée russe qui est en train de faire face à certains problèmes de logistique et de déplacement. On va être là pour aider ces Ukrainiens et on va continuer d'être là aussi avec de plus en plus de sanctions qui, même juste après un mois, sont en train d'avoir un impact dévastateur sur l'économie russe et dans les mois et aussi longtemps que ça prendra qui viennent, vont continuer de faire énormément mal à Vladimir Poutine et à ceux qui l'appuient.
Following up.
The U.S. today committed to welcoming 100,000 refugees, many of whom will end up with permanent residency. Is Canada willing to commit to that same number or exceed it?
We have said from the very beginning that we are working as hard as we can to welcome as many people as we can, as fast as we can. We've brought in new measures. And when I was in Poland just a couple of weeks ago, I saw the extent to which people are both fleeing to safety, but also torn about not going too far from their loved ones who remain in Ukraine, their husbands, their fathers, their sons. But Canada has an extraordinarily generous number of Canadians from coast to coast to coast who want to do more to welcome Ukrainians into their homes, into their families. Many Ukrainians will choose to connect with family they have in Canada, seek permanent residency. Others will simply come for the time it needs to settle things at home and then return. But no matter what, particularly when we think about the young people that I met in Warsaw, who are so uncertain about their future, that is the generation that will be returning to rebuild Ukraine after this war is done. We need to make sure that they are given all the support they can during these extremely difficult times. And that means welcoming them to Canada. That means ensuring we're supporting the schools and the programs here in Europe that they need. The leaders in our meetings today were absolutely committed to do everything we can to support the refugee crisis, the humanitarian crisis, and the military crisis that is all because of Vladimir Putin.
Prochaine question.
Thank you very much. David Aiken, Global News. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Just want to talk about something Mr. Stoltenberg talked a lot about today, which is the reset of the defense of Europe. That sounds like a big strategic shift, and I wondered if you could talk how that strategic shift of one of our major allies, European allies, how that might look to Canada and how Canada might play a role in this reset of the defense of Europe.
Well, The conversations around where NATO is going strategically was always going to be on the agenda for our upcoming NATO Leaders Summit in Spain at the end of June. So over the past number of years, we've been building towards a reflection on what NATO needs to do, what we need to reflect on going forward. Obviously, even though for years, certainly since the illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea, Russia's aggressive posturing has been top of mind for NATO. The recent horrific invasion of a sovereign neighbor by Russia brings a new level of urgency and reflection to how we ensure we're standing up not just for our NATO allies in Europe, but for democracies and the rule of law and the values that underpin them in Europe and around the world. Those are the conversations that we're certainly already going to have going into June, but now over this past month have become even more important and even more pointed on standing up not just for the geographic alliance that is NATO, but the alliance of values and principles that we all stand for.
Following up.
And you mentioned energy exports or modest help from Canada. I assume that's because we're a little constrained in terms of capacity to get oil and gas offshore. But on food, we're not constrained at all. We put a ton of stuff in boats and whatever. How do we get Canadian producers who are about to plant their crops to grow as much wheat as Ukraine will be unable to grow, for example, this spring? How do we get Canada into the food security game?
Canada is very much in the food security game already and will continue to be. The G7 agriculture ministers just met last week to talk exactly about this, and that was a significant topic of conversation this afternoon in our G7 leaders meeting as well. The issue of food security, how we can ensure that at home we're planting as much as possible, and that is something that Canada can contribute to, not just with the extraordinary work of our agricultural industry across the country, but also resources like potash and connections to the world that can be very helpful. But also how we, through our international partnerships, ensure that people around the world are able to plant significant amounts for this year, because we know that this illegal war in Russia and its impact both on Ukraine and on Russia is going to lead to real challenges around food security in the world, and it's certainly something that as leaders we are united on wanting to address. Vladimir Putin has made this year a lot more difficult for people all around the world, and countries like the countries gathered here today are resolved to help that as much as possible.
On va prendre une dernière question de Canadian Press.
Hi, Prime Minister. Jordan Press with CP. I want to just go back on spending one more time. And it's because you have made a lot of promises in regards to the agreement with the NDP for spending on pharmacare, dental care, and now there's a pledge to increase spending on the military. And I'm wondering if you can explain a bit to Canadians how you plan to balance all those competing needs in an upcoming budget without having structural deficits be the outcome.
First of all, our commitment to continue to invest more in our military is something that this government has been committed to for many years. Unlike when under the previous government spending on defense dipped to below 1% of GDP, we've actually moved forward on investing more, including with Strong, Secure and Engaged, which is a ambitious commitment to increase the capacity and support for the Canadian Armed Forces to have the kinds of equipment and ability to do the things that Canadians expect them to be able to do around the world, for NATO, for allies and partners, and UN peacekeeping and elsewhere. So we have always been committed to doing more on defense, and we will continue to do that. The agreement with the NDP is very much about delivering on specific things for Canadians, but doesn't in any way impact on the choices we make in areas not covered by that agreement. Canadians expect us to be fiscally responsible and do the things that they need us to invest in. That's exactly what we've always done and what we will continue to do.
Following up.
And I wanted to just ask you about sanctions, since you announced more today. You called them crippling for the Russian economy, that this is supposed to dissuade Vladimir Putin from continuing this unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. At a certain point, though, sir, is there a concern that they're not having the same kind of level of effectiveness that you hoped? And I'm wondering if you can draw a bit of a line for us about what more you may want, at what point do you feel they're not being effective, and what more you and your allies have talked about doing to make them effective?
Excellent question, because one of the things that is at the core of our response, even as we're here talking about the military alliance that is NATO, is the coordinated response on economic sanctions that the West has pulled together. And we know that Vladimir Putin, when he planned this invasion of Ukraine, baked in to his planning a certain amount of sanctions that he was going to see from the West. But what he didn't expect was both the level of coordination, alignment, and ambition on those sanctions that he saw. Things like the SWIFT banking system on numerous Russian banks, the sanctions on the Russian central bank's ability to access reserves internationally were things that he never expected to see. So from day one, the strength of these sanctions made a real impact. And as we've said, not only are we committed to keeping those sanctions in place as long as it takes, many more months, more years if that's what's necessary, although hopefully not, we are ready to do that. On top of that, we are also committed to steadily increasing those sanctions. And the thing with sanctions like this is, yes, you can start feeling the impact after a few days or a few weeks, as we're seeing right now. The ruble is crashing. The stock market in Russia is struggling. People are seeing real pain across Russia from this economic reality. Over the coming months, as they continue, that pain will only get harder and harder and harder for the Russian economy to bear. And there is one person, and one person only, who is responsible for that, and that is Vladimir Putin. His choice to wage an illegal, horrific war against innocent neighbors has brought the world together in a level of unity and determination to make sure that he fails and that everyone in Russia know he fails. That's why we are standing with Ukraine. That's why we are so united here today. That's why we will continue to be united long into the future.
Thank you. This is what ends today's press conference. C'est ce qui m'a fait la conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui.
Merci tout le monde.